What up, YouTube? Welcome to Chicago Reacts. My name is Jared, as always joined by Kelly, and today we'll be reacting to World War I, The Seminal Tragedy by Extra Credits Part 1. Very excited for this series.
World War I. Do we know anything about this?
Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. Haven't learned much about World War I since like middle school. Gonna be honest with you guys. So
Same like how we were with Napoleon.
yeah,
We're jumping right into it and we don't know anything about it. But
pretty much.
we're excited, and again, thank you guys. And if you could like and subscribe, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, definitely make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't done that already. And let's jump into the video. Good start. I like
Human history is equal parts heroism, tragedy, and misunderstanding. Very rarely have we displayed all three to such a degree as in the First World War. This war is called the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, because without it there is no Stalin and no Hitler, no fascism or World War II. Without it, we don't have a Cold War that leads us to the very brink of annihilation, nor do we see the Middle East carved up by old men, still bitter from 4 years of meaningless self-inflicted catastrophe. Without this war, we probably don't have 9/11 or the turmoil in the Middle East today. This war ushered in the modern age, born in a crucible of gunpowder and toxic smoke and the blood of 10 million men. Blood spilt in war from the fields of France to the waters off America, from the Russian frontier to the sands of the Middle East, from the Chinese mainland to the deepest parts of the sea. This war broke empires. It shattered the past and forced us to give up our last ties to our medieval understanding. When the smoke cleared and a stunned world climbed out of its trenches, we lived in a new age, with new powers, new ideas, and new terrors. It is the defining event of the 20th century. It is the Great War. But it's not the war itself that we're here to talk about today. Hopefully, over the course of this show, a bit at a time, we'll slowly, story by story, cover the sprawling events of this turning point in history. But today we are focused on the events that led to this war. For if the war itself is the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, then the weeks before the war are its seminal tragedy. In these next few episodes, we'll focus on the very human, very personal stories that led Europe to consume itself, to ignite itself in one suicidal blaze from which it still hasn't recovered, because it is a tragedy of the highest order. It's like a play, a Greek epic, a story so grand we would think it must be fiction if the scars of the war couldn't still be seen on the fields of France. It's Shakespeare living out before us. It begins with the death of a prince and his lady, and ends in mass slaughter the likes of which the world has never seen. So let's set the stage. For 100 years, Europe has been at peace. There have been wars, sure, but they were minor wars. Wars on the periphery. Wars without many of the great powers involved. Not since Napoleon did the great states of Europe vie in bloody battle. For after the ravages of the Napoleonic Wars, the statesmen of Europe had come together to try to stop such a catastrophe from ever happening again. They created a system called the Concert of Europe, so that whenever war seemed perilously close, the nations of Europe would come together in a conference, and instead come to a settlement that all parties would abide by. But Europe has changed since those weary of the Napoleonic conflicts first came together to create the Great Concert. The first and most major change was the formation of Germany. At the time our story begins, it's important to remember Germany as a nation was only 40 years old. It's a young nation, a strong one, a nation looking to claim its own. But to say that Germany was a strong nation is to undersell the magnitude of its creation. I mean to say that the birth of Germany was something perhaps unique in the history of the world. For overnight, with the signing of a few papers, the middle of Europe was transformed from 1,000 tiny squabbling states.
Before that 40 years that Germany existed, it was called Prussia.
Yes.
To the
And I
greatest
wouldn't have known
land
that
power the
without
world
watching
had ever known. In one night, suddenly the most powerful nations of Europe, Russia, France, Austria-Hungary, and England, were not the most powerful nations in Europe any longer. Overnight, in the very heart of Europe, had been created a nation with more manpower, natural resources, and economic strength than any other nation in the world except perhaps for Great Britain. Moreover, this creation was cemented in the defeat of France, which at the time was considered the strongest land power in Europe. And at the time of our story, that defeat and its memory still run deep. And now, look at the world from the perspective of that powerful new German nation. Here they are, arguably the most powerful country in the world, and yet they see themselves being denied all the rights of a great world power. Britain and France held territories across the globe. Even the Netherlands, a nation which the might of the new Germany could wipe off the face of the earth in a week, had colonies from Asia all the way to Africa. But Germany, for all of their strength, had been denied those possessions simply because their nation was young. Imagine what this does to the balance of power. Imagine what this does to the geopolitical scene. Think what would happen today if, say, the entire EU declared themselves a single nation with a single economy, a single military, and a single foreign policy. Imagine if they said that they wanted greater access to Middle Eastern oil, and Russia and the United States said, no, we were here first. Imagine now if representatives from Russia and the United States smiled and told this young nation that they'd be happy to continue to sell them oil at an inflated price, though. This was the position Germany found itself in. How was the concert of Europe, a system built around a balance of power and compromise, to last in these circumstances? And yet, for 40 years, it did, and this brings us to the second major change since the Napoleonic Wars: the men. The 70 years after those wars was a time of giants, men who towered over the world stage. Time and again here, Europe rolled well on the dice of history and came up with leaders who were capable of navigating an increasingly complex and increasingly modern geopolitical world. In the 1800s, Russians saw men like Alexander II, who understood that Russia needed to modernize to survive. He began dismantling serfdom, reformed judicial practices, encouraged universities, and pursued peace, understanding that Russia was in no position to fight the major European powers. Like all the men here, this guy was not all chuckles and sunshine. Alexander II brutally suppressed revolutionaries and separatists in the territories Russia controlled. Still, he was effective, without question. By 1900, we...
Alexander II. So that was obviously after Alexander I. But Alexander I was the guy that tried to take down Napoleon, I believe, right? I think. Alexander I was Napoleon's enemy. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure. I'm not positive, but let me know if I'm right.
have in Russia Nicholas II, a deeply reactionary, deeply conservative man who history records as being of middling intellect with neither the training nor the inclination to properly rule. His reign is a catalog of embarrassing mismanagement. This is the man who fell under the sway of the mystic Rasputin. This is a man who couldn't even coordinate his own coronation. A man who let 1,300 people die in a human stampede on the day he was crowned, because, I kid you not, there was not enough beer and pretzels. And this is the man who held a ball that day anyway, because, hey, why let a few hundred deaths spoil your day? And this is the man who will, in the end, hold the fate of the world in his hands. And by this point in Austria, we have as emperor an 84-year-old man, 2 years away from his death and battered by the weight of the life he's led. His foreign minister, Berthold, is neither a bad man nor a stupid man, but he is a weak and vacillating man at a time when European politics are all about strength. And Germany? Germany, during the 20 years following its creation, had unquestionably one of the greatest diplomats the world has ever seen, Otto von Bismarck. This is a man of great ability and great appetites, a man known to smoke 3 cigars at once and down a bottle of champagne at breakfast, a man who probably deserves an entire episode just to himself, but for our purposes, he is the man who held the concert of Europe together under the incredible strain of the creation of the new German state. His life's work was to ensure that France and Russia never allied, so that Germany would never be surrounded. This was his nightmare, his greatest fear. And in this, like in many things, he turned out to be right. He famously said that the great European conflagration would come from some damn fool thing in the Balkans, and he warned Kaiser Wilhelm II that within 20 years, his bellicose policies would destroy the Kaiserreich. And he was correct almost to the day. But he was fired by Kaiser Wilhelm II, who has too much historical baggage to get an accurate view of. Suffice it to say that the...
Otto von Bismarck, we learned a lot about him in another series. So if you haven't seen that series yet, make sure to go check that out after this video.
Kaiser often ends up with a reputation for feeling inadequate. Having been born with a withered arm and grown up hounded by his mother, he came to believe that he had to prove he was masculine, and so set out to break with Bismarck's policies and show that he was his own man by abandoning the German alliance with Russia and moving Germany towards a much more expansionist stance. He was known for being brash and impulsive, with little tact, crumbling the carefully balanced alliances that had for so long kept the concert of Europe in place. Now to all this, we have to add one last piece to the stage. Fear. The fear of the dying empires. The fear of those once great nations that now so clearly saw the shadow of death approaching them from behind. The Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. The Ottoman Empire was long known as the sick man of Europe. Its decline had been long and slow, with the surrounding nations taking bites out of its carcass as it slowly died. The Austro-Hungarian Empire looked at the fate of the Ottomans and saw shadows of what was to come. They feared they'd be like the Ottomans, dismantled, taken apart piece by piece until they were too weak to fight back. They had once been the most powerful state in Europe, but they ruled over many nations and many peoples, and over the 19th century those peoples had asserted themselves, crying out for their own nations, crying out to be free, to, as people, decide their own fate. And so, through the 19th century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire saw its territory chipped away as the other great nations of the concert of Europe ruled in their conferences that those people had a right to be free. And with each loss, those peoples that the Austro-Hungarian Empire still maintained control of agitated for their own freedom to a greater and greater extent, causing unrest that rocked the empire to its very core. And lastly, we have the Russians. The Russian Tsars ruled the largest country in the world, but like the Ottomans, their military, economy, and infrastructure were woefully behind the times. And in 1905, when the Russians lost a war with the Japanese, the first time a European power had lost a war to an Asian one in modern history, their weakness became eminently clear to the world. This loss caused a revolution that forced the Tsar to accept a parliament and a constitutional monarchy. But it wasn't in the nature of Alexander II to accept a parliament, and he rebelled against these constraints, leaving his country precariously perched on the verge of revolution. So with a new superpower in the midst of Europe, fear driving crumbling empires to irrational and desperate decisions, and a group of leaders simply not equal to their forebearers at the task of guiding the ships of state, the players are all in place. The stage is set, and the curtain begins to rise on the war to end all wars. Join us next time for an improbable assassination, the death of a prince, and a sandwich which changed history.
All right.
I'm nervous.
A lot of information.
Yeah,
Moved very, very quickly.
it did.
Um,
Yeah, I feel like I'm still catching up.
yeah, still
Love it.
processing a lot of that. But yeah, I think they set the table nicely for what's to come. It's a world war, so we're gonna see a lot of the commanders, generals that we're familiar with from some of the other
Right.
some of the other videos. Obviously, this takes place in 1902, but as far as just the countries that we've seen in a lot of the other series, Italy, France, Germany, Austria, it's gonna be another bloodbath. So I'm excited for what's to come.
Yeah, and since it does move so quick, it's a little harder for me to maybe like interpret it. So if you guys want to comment anything and let us know, maybe break it down a little bit more.
Some spark notes, perhaps.
Yeah, about anything that's not mentioned in these. We like to engage in conversation with you guys too. So that's if you want to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Make sure to leave some comments and let us know what you're expecting to see in part 2. And yeah, so thank you guys for watching this video. That was World War I, the Seminal Tragedy by Extra Credits, part 1. So be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't done that already. And check out other videos as well, guys. If there's any other videos you'd like us to react to, just let us know down in the comments, and we'll see you guys next time.